Our text this morning is verses 24 through 30. We'll be finishing Mark 7 next week. And so read with me, if you will, Mark 7, starting in verse 24. And from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. As you read with me, you know that we're approaching an interesting text. Because in some ways, it's like a cookie-cutter repeat of so many things that we've already heard in Mark's gospel. We hear about people in a dilemma, people trusting in Jesus, Jesus coming through for them and working a miracle and healing them. And sometimes we hear so much repetition. Oh, he did this for Jairus. He did this for the man with the legion. He's done this for Simon's mother-in-law. He's done this for crowds of people. What's the point? It's just a repetition of something that's already happened. Something that we'll hear about many more times as we read throughout the gospel and countless times as you read throughout the New Testament. But the reality is there are details about this story that set it apart from the rest. And there is a point. First of all, Jesus leaves Israel. That's a big deal. We're going to talk about it a bit this morning. We're going to talk more about it next week. What does it mean that Jesus is leaving Israel? What does that mean for Mark's gospel? It's significant. But then there's another point that's unique and kind of weird that we're going to have to deal with, and that's Jesus throws a curveball at this woman, doesn't he? He calls her a dog. What's the deal with that? Well, that's really the emphasis. The unique details are what's going to show us what Mark is trying to emphasize, what Mark is trying to point out as being the purpose or the overall point of the story. And I'll tell you this, I believe the point of the story is about approaching Jesus. Sure, we have the power of Jesus in this text. We have ministry to the Gentiles in this text. Those are really secondary points. The main point is about how this woman approaches Jesus and how Jesus commends her for her approach. Tim Keller, in his chapter of his book opening, covering this passage, he says this: how do you approach God? How do you connect with God? Most of us can think of two options. There's the ancient understanding of God. God is a bloodthirsty tyrant who needs to be constantly appeased by good behavior, if not by outright sacrifice. And then there's the modern understanding of God. He's a spiritual force we can access at any time we want, no questions asked. But Mark tells us a story showing us that approaching God might mean something else entirely. In other words, Jesus isn't this tyrannical warrior deity that needs to be appeased by blood or by some kind of sacrifice. We also see that the modern idea that he's not some disembodied consciousness that we can tap into his power at any time we want, or meditate or whatever. He's not like that. Jesus is as he's revealed in Scripture. Jesus defines himself. And so we'll see how it is that this text tells us how we can approach Jesus. But let's begin to move through the text. You'll notice verse 24 says, he went away from there, and he went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. First of all, when it says he went away from there, where are we talking about? Where is he? Where does he go away from? Well, we're not entirely sure. The last geographical marker we had was in chapter 6. They were in Gennesaret. Gennesaret, I think, is on the southwest side of the Sea of Galilee. Tyre is 30 or 40 miles to the north, and it's outside of the borders of Israel. But again, the last geographical marker we had was that Jesus was in Gennesaret. He was healing sick people in the marketplaces, probably around a lot of Gentiles. And after that, his disciples eat with defiled hands, and the Pharisees come and say, "What is the deal? Why aren't you guys holding to the tradition of the elders?" And we spent 3 weeks talking about that fight and how Jesus answered them. So it seems like Jesus left from Gennesaret on the southwest side of the Sea of Galilee. By the way, next week I'll show you a map and we'll kind of chart where we've been and where Jesus is going, because some of you probably aren't familiar with the geography and it might not mean as much. But anyway, this is a 30 or 40 mile trip that he took to the region of Tyre. But what's important is that Tyre is outside of Israel. Tyre is not within the borders of Israel. It is Gentile territory. Now, this is not Jesus' first encounter with Gentiles. In fact, being from Galilee, Jesus would have had lots of contact with Gentiles. Isaiah chapter 9, 700 years before the Gospels, calls Galilee, Galilee of the Gentiles. And so there were lots of Gentiles in Galilee for hundreds of years. And with Jesus being an artisan, with Jesus being a builder, a carpenter, or a stoneworker of some sort, his business that his father and he would have engaged in, they would have been working with Gentiles. In fact, I believe, and lots of people believe, Jesus would have spoken Greek and been multilingual because of his contact with Gentiles. And throughout Mark's gospel, Gentiles have come to Jesus. We saw that in chapter 3. We saw a crowd from outside of that said Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea, which is Edom, which is south of Israel, and from beyond the Jordan, which is east, and it's Gentile territory, and from around Tyre and Sidon, which is where he comes now. So Jesus worked with Gentiles a lot, and that's going to be important for our text. When Jesus went to the Decapolis, that's a Greco-Roman region within Israel. There would have been lots of Gentiles there. They were raising pigs. So Jesus has frequent contact with Gentiles, but here we see him not letting Gentiles come to him, he goes to them. He goes to Tyre. More specifically, Tyre should sound a little bit familiar to you if you are familiar with your Old and New Testaments. Tyre had an interesting relationship with Israel over the generations. Israel liked to play political chess and strategize with the nations around them. Sometimes you hear about them making a pact with Egypt. Sometimes you hear with them at war with Egypt, and pacts with Syria, and pacts with Tyre, and wars with Syria and Tyre, and pacts with Assyria, and then the Assyrian invasion. And so Israel kind of liked to play chess with Tyre from time to time. Of course, that was before the Roman rule. And many times when you read the prophets, you hear God list off these nations that he's going to judge. Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and a lot of times Tyre falls on that list. And so the point is, Israel wasn't always the biggest fan of Tyre, and God sometimes wasn't always the biggest fan of Tyre. More specifically is the relationship between Galilee and Tyre. Remember, Jesus is from Galilee. Well, how did the Galileans feel about the Tyrians, or those from Tyre? Well, Darrell Bach says this: relations were strained between Galilee and Tyre. Agricultural resources often migrated from Galilee to Tyre, leaving some Jewish folks in Galilee with little to eat. And so they had this economic competition going on. In fact, Josephus says that Tyre is our bitterest enemies, and he notes that they have ill will. So Galilee and Tyre at this point are strained. They're not huge fans of one another. So what does that have to do with Jesus going to Tyre? What does that matter? Why am I giving you this historical background? Well, because it should tell us something about Jesus and his mission. Of course, as he goes to Tyre this morning, there's no recorded ministry other than this one encounter with this woman. But Jesus was willing to go behind enemy lines, as it were. Jesus was willing to work with other ethnicities. Jesus was willing to work with other cultures. In fact, he was really no respecter of ethnicities. He esteemed people from all cultures and ethnicities as being equal, as being made in God's image. And he goes to them. In fact, this might remind you of the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. You might think about John chapter 4, verses 3 through 5. It says that Jesus had to pass through Samaria. He was in Judea. He was going back to Galilee, which is a straight shot north. But Jesus had to pass through Samaria. Why would it say that? Because in those days, when Jews went from Judea to Galilee, or backwards, they went from Galilee to Judea, they would go all the way around. You know why? Because they hated the Samaritans. They're a bunch of half-breeds, they're pagans, they're detestable. But what about Jesus? What does he think about the Samaritans? Well, he had to pass through Samaria. He had to meet that woman. He had to minister to that community. Jesus doesn't esteem cultures the same way that we do. Jesus is willing to work with cultures in a way that we should be able to imitate. Again, this morning, he doesn't really do much ministry in Tyre. In fact, I'm going to suggest he comes here to hide and to get away for a while. But the fact is, he's willing to do that in enemy territory, which a lot of times people struggle with because of racism and because of cultural differences. This really should tell us something about that, because many times our knee-jerk reaction, we observe a culture that does something different than us. whether it's their language or a tradition or whatever it is. And our knee-jerk reaction is, well, we don't do it like that. And we assume, maybe we don't speak it, well, we're better than that. Jesus doesn't feel that way. Jesus esteems all people from all ethnicities as being the same. In fact, he enters their world. Many times we're not interested in learning their language or their culture or their traditions. We don't really want to know about them. We don't want to understand them, but Jesus does. In fact, Jesus doesn't just want to understand Gentiles. He wanted to understand people in general in a different way by coming to us. Now, I have to be careful saying that because God knows everything. But the gospel does affirm, and throughout Hebrews in the New Testament, that in a special way, Jesus came to us to experience life with us. And we should be able to imitate that want to understand and be around those who aren't like us. That's the attitude that we should imitate. In fact, even Jesus' enemies recognize that. Jesus' enemies, the Pharisees, told him in Mark chapter 12, you don't care about anyone's opinion, and you're not swayed by appearances. They said, you don't look at people's faces, is literally what it says. Of course, that's flattery, but it's true. They recognized it. You don't esteem people the same way that we do. You don't look at that kind of stuff the same way that we do. And I think this, even as simple as going to a different region, even if it's just to get some rest, can inform how we engage with people from different cultures. What does that look like for us? It might mean you going on the mission field. It might mean somebody coming and staying in your home and you being hospitable to them, even though they're from a different culture that you don't understand. It certainly means loving people that you don't understand and witnessing to those from different cultures. You might know something more specific about what that means for you, but let Jesus' interaction with Gentiles and other cultures inform us. As the text continues, Mark tells us he didn't want anyone to know. You can look at that in verse 24. He didn't want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. You might ask the question, why would Jesus go somewhere and not want anybody to know? If you've been with us, if you're familiar with the Gospels, then that shouldn't be a surprise to you. We know that Jesus keeps secrets sometimes. Jesus kept his identity a secret for a while. And even once certain people gathered what his identity really was, you're the Christ, aren't you? He says, don't tell anybody. There are certain things that he withholds from the populace. I'll tell you more, I'll kind of remind you more of that next week, but you can even see the demons. You're the Christ, you're the Son of God. And he silences them because Jesus keeps secrets sometimes. And so he goes to Tyre. He doesn't want anyone to know. And I think there's a more specific reason Jesus doesn't want anyone to know. And I think it's because Jesus is getting away to get some rest. You might remember in chapter 6, Jesus told the disciples when they get back from the mission, he says, let's go get some rest. Did they get any rest? No, they didn't. And so as things move forward, it seems like he still hasn't gotten any rest yet. And so if he's going to have to leave Israel so that nobody will recognize him. So he goes away to be hidden. And it comes as no surprise as people do recognize him, because he comes there, says he could not be hidden, and a woman recognizes him and hears of him and comes to him. How would this woman recognize him? Well, for a couple of reasons. We know lots of people came from Tyre to Galilee in chapter 3, from around the region of Tyre and Sidon. This great crowd comes. So either she might have come, maybe her neighbors had come, or so somebody there recognized him. Also, you can think about the fact that he had 12 apostles or 12 disciples with him. That might have been seeing 13 guys together that are Jewish. You might go, oh, okay, picking that up pretty quick. So for some reason, she recognizes him, and it's really no surprise that his rest gets interrupted. Because every time Jesus has tried to get rest in this gospel so far, it's been interrupted. Chapter 1, Jesus is healing, and he leaves early in the morning so that he can go pray. And his disciples find him and say, hey, where have you been? We're looking for you. Again, just in chapter 6, let's go get some rest. People recognize him and they go, that's Jesus, and they run ahead of them and get where they're going. And so again here, Jesus is interrupted. In fact, Matthew, in his account of this in Matthew chapter 15, says that she came and made a racket. She was screaming and crying, and the apostles are, Lord, send her away. Man, she's annoying and loud. But Jesus talks to her. And so now we hear of why this woman came to him. It says in verse 25, immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell at his feet. And so this woman comes to him because her daughter is possessed by a demon. Now, a lot of us are familiar with the fact that the Gospels tell lots of stories about children being possessed by demons. There's a handful of them. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, but we also shouldn't be desensitized to it either. Really, think about how wicked it is that Satan and one of his demons would possess a child. And in the bigger picture of the Bible, we need to recognize that Satan hates children. He really does. You can see that throughout Scripture. You can see it throughout all of human history. You look at children possessions. You look at child sacrifice throughout pagan nations. You look at Pharaoh and Herod committing genocide against babies. You look at child trafficking and abortion and child slavery. Satan hates children. And sometimes people do too. And the reality is, as Christians, we need to be about the business of loving children. When we hear about things like child trafficking or abortion, we need to recognize them for the satanic things that they are, because Satan is behind them and he hates children. And we need to be about the business of combating that hatred and of loving and serving children. Again, what does that look like for you? Well, it might be adoption. It might be campaigning against abortion or child trafficking or one of those things. It might mean finding a way to feed hungry children in your community or in another community. It might mean loving and serving the children in your family. I simply say, Satan hates your kids, and you need to love them because Jesus does. And he wants you to serve them and make disciples out of them. You can apply that in whichever way fits you. We see an example of that in this woman. This woman is willing to cross cultural barriers for her daughter to come to Jesus and to boldly and persistently ask him to heal her. You notice in verse 26, it says the woman was a Gentile. You know what a Gentile means. It's somebody that's not a Jew. But then it says that she's a Syrophoenician. A Syrophoenician. That's not a word we use a whole lot today. We don't hear about a lot of Syrophoenicians running around. And so we have to ask the question, what is a Syrophoenician? Who is this woman? You might be able to see in the word that it's a compound of two words, Syro and Phoenician. Syro referring to the area of Syria, and Phoenician being the Phoenician peoples. And you might back up and say one more time, who are the Phoenicians? Well, the Phoenicians are a familiar people to us who read the Bible. The Phoenicians are basically the Canaanites. They are the tribes of people who have lived in Israel since before Abraham. You read about the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites, the thisites, the thatites. You hear about all these different tribes of people, and loosely speaking, the Greeks called them the Phoenicians. And so the Phoenicians, that's where she comes from. And so why does it call her the Syro-Phoenician? Why does it say that she's a Syro-Phoenician? Well, because at this point, the Phoenicians had really spread themselves out all over the Mediterranean. They didn't just live in the area of Canaan. They lived all over the place. And in fact, there were other places like Libya. They were called Libo-Phoenicians. And so this woman was a Phoenician who was from the area of Syria. Just a fun bit of historical background for you. The Phoenicians had built a trade empire that really encompassed most of the Mediterranean. And before the Romans came along, the Phoenicians dominated the Mediterranean. In fact, the war that the Romans fought with the Phoenicians were called the Punic Wars. But they didn't really go by the name Phoenicians by that time. They went by the name the Carthaginians, because the most famous route or the most famous base that they had set up was Carthage, which is modern-day Tunis or Tunisia. And so the most famous Carthaginian you've probably heard of, his name was Hannibal. He rode elephants into Italy, and he ransacked the Italian peninsula for 16 years. He killed more Romans than any other person in history, and he was a Phoenician. In fact, you can hear the word Baal in his name, Hannibal, because they worshipped Baal, and they took Baal with them all around the Mediterranean. And so that's who the Carthaginians were, that's who the Phoenicians were. And another fun fact is that our words for phone, that means sound, our word family, like phone, phonetics, what were the other ones that I wrote down? Anyway, you get them. Those come from the word, the Phoenicians, because they had developed the first alphabet that was based on sounds. You see, you have the Egyptians and the Chinese, and their alphabets are based on ideas and words. And the Phoenicians come along and say, well, we're going to build letters based on what something sounds like. And so the word sound, you hear phonics, phonetics, that's the other one, phone, that comes from the Phoenicians. So there's recent, I'm going to stop going off on that tangent, I'm sorry. So this woman is a Syrophoenician. She's a Phoenician lady with origins based in Syria. What does this have to do with her love for her child? I go off on this background. What does it have to do with the text? Well, again, she's crossing cultural barriers. At this time, this would have been considered kind of inappropriate and scandalous. Tim Keller says this: she knows that she has none of the religious, moral, cultural credentials necessary to approach a Jewish rabbi. She's a Phoenician. She's a Gentile. She's a woman. Her daughter has an unclean spirit. This woman really has no resume to bring to Jesus. It was inappropriate for her, seemingly so, to come to Jesus. You can even think about when Jesus went to the Samaritan woman. How did she respond? He said, "Woman, would you get me something to drink?" And she goes, "Why are you talking to me? You're a Jewish man. You're a rabbi. What are you talking to me for? I'm a Gentile woman." This woman, this Syrophoenician woman, there's none of that. She's like, "I don't care. I'm going right to him. I'm going to make a racket. I'm going to beg him, and I'm going to be bold in the way that I ask him." And so that's what the text says as it continues. It says, what's interesting is Jesus' response. It says, she begs Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. Of course she would. She's a mother. She loves her daughter. She hates to see what's happening to her daughter, and she knows that Jesus has the power to heal her. But what gets really interesting is Jesus' response in verse 27. It says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Whew. Yikes. That makes some of us quiver. We go, what's going on here? Did he just call this woman a dog? Did he just call an entire race of people dogs? Keep in mind, Jesus is willing to go across cultural barriers and work with Gentiles and be with them. We need to remember that, is what we just saw. But also, in order for us to kind of understand the interaction here, there's a verse from Matthew that helps. It's Matthew 15:28. It's in the same parallel story. And the first thing that Jesus says to her is, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So when he says, "Let the children be fed first," he's talking about the Jews. I'm here to work with the Jews first. Okay? So that's the first thing that he tells her. Does that mean that Jesus wasn't interested in Gentiles? Does that mean that Jesus didn't come to save or to love Gentiles? Well, no. We just saw that Jesus is willing to go to Samaritans. He's willing to go to Tyre. When Gentiles come to him, he's willing to work with them. And this is really the way that we see things play out in the New Testament, is that Jesus is primarily concerned with Israel. Not solely, but primarily. Okay? Notice Romans 1:16. Paul says the gospel is the power of God unto salvation for the Jew first, and then for the Greek, or then for the Gentile, or then for us. And then in the next chapter, you might think, well, salvation's for the Jews first. But then in Romans chapter 2, verse 9, Paul, speaking of judgment, says there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, for the Jew first, and then for the Greek. Because God works first, primarily, with Israel. That might sound unfair, but that's the way that it is. They get salvation first, they get judgment first. We Gentiles pick up the crumbs after them. Now, when you look at the Old Testament, God originally always wanted to save the whole world, but he used Israel to do it. He used Jesus, the King of the Jews, to do it. And so primarily, God's dealings are first and foremost with Jews, and then we get the rest. So it's not that Jesus doesn't love Gentiles. It's just that in the New Testament, Jesus comes and works with Israel, and then when he's resurrected, where does he tell his apostles to go? Does he say, stay in Jerusalem? He says, go to the ends of the earth. Make disciples of everybody. And so Jesus' mission is carried on by his apostles to go out to the rest of the world. And so it's just that God works primarily with the Jews. Now, you might ask the question, okay, so you're telling me what he's not saying. But you need to do some explanation as far as why would he call this woman a dog? Why would he call Gentiles dogs? You might ask, don't Middle Eastern cultures think dogs are unclean scavengers? And to be fair, like 99% of the time, when you read the word dog in the Bible, it's being used maliciously. It's being used as an insult. We saw one this morning in Sunday school in Philippians chapter 3. Paul said, watch out for the dogs. And he's talking about the Judaizers, the people who are trying to corrupt the gospel. And so most of the time when the word dog is used, it's used in a malicious way. But there's a really important note that you need to know, and it's that Jesus doesn't quite use the same word for dog here that's used in those other instances. In fact, Jesus does call somebody a dog maliciously in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, do not give what is holy to the dogs, which sounds really familiar to what he's saying here. Don't take the bread and give it to the dogs. But again, the word is different. In fact, the word in Greek is kuon, or kun. It's the same family where we get our word coon, raccoon, hound, canine. It's the similar word. But in this case, Jesus uses the word kunarion, which is more like saying puppy or doggy. It's not right to take the children's bread and give it to the puppies. Sounds a little bit less harsh, doesn't it? A little bit less malicious. And then you might ask the question, but didn't the Jews hate dogs? Don't Middle Eastern cultures think that dogs are just these nasty scavengers? And when you look at modern Middle Eastern Muslim countries, they do. But one article that I read, and the reality is that was my understanding until I had done a little bit more research in preparation for this study, this sermon, and I learned some pretty cool stuff. But this one scholar thinks that that's anachronistic. He thinks that we're taking a modern concept and we're importing it back into the past. He says that dogs weren't seen in the way that they are now by Muslims. There was a little bit more of a range of how people treated dogs. And even though dog was used as an insult, it wasn't only used as an insult. You can even think about our culture. We insult people by calling them dogs. Not if you're a Christian, you shouldn't. But even though our language uses that word as an insult, it's also not always bad. And the reality is, in those days, let me give you a few examples of pet ownership. Dogs, there is a dog cemetery. There have been dog cemeteries excavated in Philistine cities, where they found dogs that had been buried carefully and uniformly. They're wrapped in garments and they're laid in the same way all over these Philistine cities, like Ashkelon, stories that we read about in the Old Testament. Ancient militaries used dogs. The Romans used dogs. People had dogs for security. People used dogs to herd their animals. In fact, Job, in Job 30, verse 1, says that he has sheepdogs, basically. He says that he has dogs working in his flock. There's an apocryphal book called Tobit, and it mentions that there's a young man who goes on a journey and a dog accompanies him. And there's 2 mentions of that in the book of Tobit. And so you might say, okay, but none of those represent Israel at the time of Jesus. You're pulling from Rome. You're pulling from the Philistines way before this. But the reality is, we're not in Israel right now. Jesus is in Tyre. And another powerful example is look at the woman's response. She says, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She cites it like it's axiomatic. Well, everybody knows that the puppies under the table get to eat. And so it seems that dogs weren't seen in such a malicious light as we see. And so when we hear Jesus calling this woman a dog, it's not an insult. Dogs weren't seen as bad as we think they were. And the word, again, is a little bit more like puppy or doggy. And so at the end of the day, Darrell Bach says this, the term is probably not as positive as it would be for us, but it's also not as negative as it could have been for them. And so really, Jesus is, that's what he's saying. And you also notice that he says, let the children be fed first. There's an order of operations. You can come later. So you might ask the question, I'm engaging in a lot of questions with you this morning. If Jesus isn't insulting her, then what's he doing? If he's not insulting her, then why is he calling her a dog? I think there's 2 reasons that he calls her a dog, or at least that he uses this phrase. And the first is that you have to remember Jesus is trying to get away. He's trying to get some rest. And this woman is interrupting him. He's coming away to be in a house with his disciples and probably to teach them and to minister to them. And she barges in and she's screaming and crying and yelling. And he says, hold on. He gives her a bit of a stiff arm. This isn't proper. I'm here doing something and you're trying to just barge in and interrupt us. But there's another reason that I think he tells her this, and it's something that Jesus actually does a couple of more times in the New Testament. Jesus likes to throw curveballs at people. Jesus likes to bring people to a fork in the road and allow them to make a decision. He says, I'm going to say something weird, and your response is going to reveal the character of your faith. If your faith is genuine, you'll continue to follow me. If your faith is fake, then you'll walk away. In fact, there's a really clear example of this in John chapter 6. You don't have to turn there. You can write this down later if you want to come back and look at it. But Jesus tells people, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. Now imagine you don't know anything about the New Testament and you're following a guy in a crowd and he says, eat my flesh and drink my blood. In fact, in the early church, those kinds of things that were said within Christianity about the Lord's table is why pagans thought we were cannibals. They talk about eating the Lord's body and drinking his blood. They thought it was like this human sacrifice cannibalistic thing. But John 6 goes like this. People come to Jesus. It's the gigantic crowd that wants him to feed them, and they say, hey, you know what would be really cool, and we would probably believe in you if you fed us the way that Moses fed our fathers. And Jesus says, you know what? Moses didn't feed your fathers. My father did. And as a matter of fact, I'm the manna that he fed to them. And they go, what? That's kind of weird. They say, how can he say something like that? And Jesus just keeps getting weirder and weirder. He says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life and abides in me. And the people will respond, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? This is a hard saying. And then Jesus says to his disciple, in fact, right after that, John says, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him. Jesus said weird stuff that thinned out the crowds. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, do you want to go too? What are you going to do? Are you going to go? And the 12 say, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe in you. We know that you're the Holy One of God. And so, do you see what he's doing there? He's saying weird stuff to see how people respond and to reveal how genuine their faith is. Okay? Take that idea and look at what Jesus did to this woman. Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. See him bringing her to a fork in the road? See him throwing a curveball at her? I'm going to say something weird to you that you might take as offensive. And everybody's going to see how you're going to respond to that. We're going to see if you're arrogant and offended, or we're going to see if you're faithful and persistent. And so, this is also to contrast this woman from the Pharisees and the disciples. Some commentators have suggested that here you have this fight with these clean Pharisees. And then here you have, and they're not faithful. They're just a bunch of hostile jerks. And then you have this unclean woman, and she's believing even though he just said something weird to her. And here are these disciples who know so much about Jesus, and yet they're struggling and stubborn and having a hard time to believe. And here's this woman who really doesn't know very much about him, and she's a Gentile, and she comes, and even though he says something weird, she persists. So a lot of people think that this is to contrast her from the Pharisees and from the disciples. But let's look at her response. Verse 28, it says, but she answered him, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Also kind of a weird response. We're going to see that Jesus commends her response as being faithful, but let's kind of divide her response and see what makes it faithful. What makes it so great that she would say something like this? Well, first of all, I want you to notice that she calls him Lord. She says, yes, Lord, or Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. When we say Lord, we kind of imply mastery. We imply Jesus' deity. Lord wasn't always used that way. This was probably her saying, yes, sir. Sir. So first of all, her response is respectful. In spite of the fact that he said something veiled and kind of weird, she still respects him. Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Next, the fact is, she still believes that he can do what he can do. She says, sir, call me what you want to call me, but I know what you can do. I know that you can heal my daughter, and I'm asking you to do it. So her response is persistent. This might remind you of a couple of parables that Jesus taught. Jesus taught a parable about an unjust judge. He said, imagine a widow goes to a judge and he's crooked. And the widow annoys him so much that he says, give the lady justice. I don't care. Get her out of here. And he says, how much more is a loving God going to respond to persistence? He says the same thing about a friend getting annoyed. He says, let's say you wake up in the middle of the night and you realize that you don't have something, and you go to your friend's house, and he's in sleep and he's in bed with his family, And he says, I'm going to give you stuff just so you'll get out of here. I just want to go back to bed with my family. And Jesus says, how much more is a loving God going to respond to persistence? And so this woman's response is persistent. Call me what you want. I still want what I know you can provide. It's bold. Finally, her response is faithful. And then she doesn't say something like, what did you just call me? She ignores it. She's humble. Whatever, call me what you want. I don't care. I just want you to heal my daughter. I love my daughter. I know you can heal her. And your words don't really mean anything. In fact, it's kind of a respectful disagreement. It's kind of fencing a little bit. Yeah, the puppies under the table eat the children's crumbs. And so Jesus turns and he says, for this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. In fact, in Matthew, he says, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. And then she goes home and she sees that's what happens. So she went home in verse 30. She went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Okay, let's press pause because I've given you a lot of information. Sorry for just dumping all that on you. What do we do with it? I tell you about this woman coming. She's a Gentile. She's a Syrophoenician. Jesus throws a curveball at her. She responds in a certain way. What does this do for us? What does this tell us about Jesus? What does this tell us about the Christian life? Well, I asserted to you at the beginning of this that this is about how to approach God. This is about how to approach Jesus. More specifically, it's about how to approach Jesus when he throws a curveball at you. Because the reality is, many of us have had Jesus throw a curveball at us, haven't we? You might ask, how would he throw a curveball at us? I'll come back to that actually. We don't like it when God challenges us. We don't like it when he changes our plans. We don't like it when he disagrees with us or brings us to a decision that we have to make a decision. And many times when he does that to us, we just try to ignore it. And no, that didn't happen. I'd rather just go on with my Christian life as I think it should be, rather than dealing with what God is trying to actually do with me. Tim Keller said this, if your God never disagrees with you, you might just be worshiping an idealized version of yourself. Ouch. When's the last time God disagreed with us? Again, you might ask the question, well, how does God disagree with us? Well, I think there are a few different ways. One, God throws curveballs at us when he changes our plans. We just saw that a few weeks ago. Jesus told the disciples, let's get some rest, and then he turned around and said, never mind. That's a curveball. That's a fork in the road. You can follow me or not, but this is what I'm doing. Sometimes he changes our plans and delays our seasons, and we don't like it. But the reality is, he throws a curveball at us, and he wants us to respond in genuine faith. The other way in which God throws curveballs at us is when he challenges our theology. Sometimes we believe something about God that's not true, and we don't like it when we find out that we're wrong. Now, it's easy for us to say that about other religions. We can say that about Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses. No, you see, Jesus is God, and it's clear. But do you know what? A lot of Christians believe the wrong things. And when we are confronted with our errors in theology, we don't like it. It's uncomfortable. We go, but I know you. I don't want you to tell me about what I have wrong. And they're incidental things a lot of times. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, Callie and I read a book about Christians and violence. And it was a stinger, because this person wrote a biblical case for how Christians should feel about violence and killing and the military and the police. It was thought-provoking. We didn't walk away agreeing with all of his conclusions, but along the way, he really challenged us to say, well, why do you believe that? Is that biblical? It hurt, because when we have errors that God corrects about our understanding about him, we don't like it. And sometimes that's how God throws a curveball at us, and we need to respond in faith and follow him anyway, and be bold and persistent anyway. Another way in which God throws curveballs at us is when he confronts issues of sin in our life. Some of us are holding on to these pet sins, and we don't want anybody to know about them. And sometimes God reveals those sins, and somebody finds out about it. Or it's just a habit that you have that one of your friends or family members or somebody else notices, and they say, hey, you know what? You do this. And it's inappropriate. And we don't like it when people notice something sinful about us. We don't like it when people confront us about something that we do wrong. And sometimes when they do it in a sinful way. Sometimes your spouse or your kids or your coworkers or your neighbor or somebody you don't like says, you know what, you're a jerk. And you're like, ugh, you're a jerk too, but you're right. And we don't like that. But the reality is, sometimes God throws curveballs at us by revealing our sin. And He's bringing us to a fork in the road where we can make a decision. Are you going to walk away, or are you going to continue to follow? Are you going to continue to approach Him in boldness and in faith and in humility? See, if Jesus appeared to you in a dream and said, you chew with your mouth open, or if Jesus appeared to you in a dream and said, you do this and it's wrong and you need to stop, it would be clearer, wouldn't it? And it might be easier to deal with, it might not. But when your kids bring correction to you, you're like, you're a kid, you don't know anything. Humility isn't just about receiving correction from Jesus or from those who you respect. Humility is about receiving correction from weak vessels. And sometimes God throws curveballs at us by letting our kids see something sinful about us, or letting our coworkers or our neighbors see, guess what, you're not perfect. You're not what you think you are. So how should we respond? We should continue in faith. We should continue boldly, as this woman did. When Jesus says, hold on a second, and He says something weird that we don't understand, we have to persist with the same faith that this woman did. Lord, okay, whatever needs to happen, please, just sanctify me. Just let me know more about you. Okay, say what you want. I agree. You love me, you know what's best, and we have to persist. How can we display this kind of faith? We can do it in prayer. You realize your prayer reflects your theology. If you really believed that God was sovereign, Del Tackett said, you wouldn't have a problem praying. You'd have a problem stopping praying. If what we pray reveals what we believe about what God is and what He can do. Kevin DeYoung asked one time, if your prayers were answered this week, who would get saved? Who would be healed? What would get fixed? That's convicting. At the end of the day, this woman could be bold, and we can be bold for the same reason. Do you know why she could approach Him boldly? Because He came to her territory. Because He made Himself available first. Of course, He was hidden, but He was still available because He crossed her borders and came to her. Do you know why we can approach God with boldness? Because He came to us. He didn't cross a cultural boundary. He didn't cross a national border. He became a man and lived with us, and we beheld His glory. You see, Jesus didn't just go into Tyre and make a household available for a woman to enter. When Jesus died and was resurrected, it says that He tore the veil in the temple. He made the way available for us to go into the very throne room of God and pray with boldness, as Hebrews 4 says. So remember this. Jesus' work for you has made boldness available to you like this woman displayed. And if we believe the gospel, and if we believe who God is and what Jesus has done, we can't stay out of the Holy of Holies. We have to go in. We have to persist. We have to pursue Him with boldness and with faith, even when He throws a curveball at us, even when He totally blindsides us with something we weren't expecting at all. Amen?